Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, get ready, Russia. Those were the words of President Donald Trump as Trump tells Putin and Assad to expect a missile attack in Syria, as he says relations now are worse than during the Cold War. Well, I'm Greg Anthony, and welcome to the Investigative Journal. And the drumbeat of war is sounding in the White House and all over the world. Trump has warned missiles will be coming after threats from Russia to shoot them down. Russia has accused the U.S. of planning to destroy evidence of the chemical attack. Syria and allies emptying military bases as they prepare for missiles. Civilian airliners warned to be cautious above the eastern Mediterranean. And it makes or break. It is a make or break time for Britain. We must show America that we are its closest ally. So Britain, France, of course, Netanyahu in Israel has said that he backs Trump's move, and he fully expects Trump to launch missiles at Syria after Sunday's supposed chemical attack near Damascus. Now, Donald Trump has told Russia to get ready for a missile attack on the Assad regime, saying the bombs will be nice and new and smart. Mr. Trump tweeted an extraordinary response to Russia's claim that it would shoot down any missiles fired at Syria. Okay, that was not the White House calling regarding the attack. But anyway, Trump tweeted an extraordinary response to Russia's claim that it would shoot down any missiles fired at Syria, following the chemical weapons attack near Damascus. The U.S. president added, "You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it." Trump later described the relationship between the U.S. and Russia as worse now than it has ever been, and that includes the Cold War, but insisted there is no reason for this. Earlier, a Russian envoy to Beirut said this: "If there is an American strike, then we will shoot down the missiles and target the positions from where they were launched." So what does that mean? War with Russia? Didn't we talk about this yesterday? Go to my show yesterday on the Investigative Journal on, what's today? April 11th, 2018. So that show was from April 10th, and I said I had to dedicate at least one show to World War III. And could this be the final, the false flag event, the final false flag event that will lead to a huge conflict between Russia, Iran, China, and then on the other side, America and all of our allies. And Russia has vowed to shoot down missiles. Would this be an act of war? And in the past few days, we've seen an escalation. This is according to Moscow, towards a significant crisis. These comments were made by a Russian envoy, and they go beyond previous threats that Russian troops would use their missile defense system to shield the Assad regime. Trump's tweets increased the pressure on Theresa May, the Prime Minister of England, as well as President of France, and they're all behind him. So on Wednesday, Trump's tweets, Moscow also suggested U.S. plans to strike could be a pretext to destroy the evidence of the alleged chemical weapons attack, which Russia has said was a staged provocation to justify Western intervention. And this is what the foreign ministry spokesman from Russia said. Is the whole idea to quickly remove the traces of provocation? The international inspectors will have nothing to look for in terms of evidence. And the Kremlin later added that it did not engage in Twitter diplomacy like the American president. And Syria has described Trump's threats as reckless escalation. So yesterday I think we kind of outlined this whole situation. And we outlined how the American people are getting the story as far as this is, of course, Russia and Syria's fault. And then in the other side of the fence, Russian population is getting the complete opposite story. So we're getting and once this happens, Israel gets involved. And once there's an attack on Israel, there is all-out war. So let's see what happens in the next 48 hours, and I hope, we don't get into a huge conflict. But as I said yesterday, is the time ready? Is the time right for World War III? We've been talking about this for years, and I've never seen all of the chess pieces in place like they are today for this huge conflict. So go to my show yesterday. I'm going to refer you to my show on April 10th, 2018, as I gave and it's the second half hour really that I got into it, as the first half hour I dedicated to the Penn State Paterno pedophilia story that broke years ago with Jerry Sandusky. And what brought that to my mind was the HBO show called Joe Paterno, where Al Pacino starred as Joe Paterno, and they went over that whole sad story at Penn State. And I added my 2 cents as far as where I thought the pedophilia rings were really coming from. And I think you'll find that to be an interesting half hour as well. So, go to my show yesterday. The winds of war are blowing like never before. Oh, but today, have you ever heard, I'm sure you've heard of Operation Paperclip. But did you ever hear of Operation Paper? Okay. Operation Paper is quite interesting. And it talks about, the whole operation had to do with America's involvement in escalating the drug trafficking throughout the world to fund wars. And it's interesting. I'm going to refer to a book called The American War Machine, and specifically Chapter 3, called Operation Paper, The United States and Drugs in Thailand and Burma, written by Peter Dale Scott. And it's an interesting read, and what it reminded me of is we've done a number of shows on the real major question: how does America and the West fund all these covert operations around the world? And the question is really as good today as if you asked it after World War II, when the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, got together with the Vatican and Pope Pius XII, and they came up with an ingenious plan. Well, it was a copycat plan that they took from Chiang Kai-shek and the war with Mao Zedong in China. And what they did was fund the war through the use of drugging their own people with heroin and opium. So they controlled the opium fields, then they drug their own people, get the money, and then they fund their wars. Well, the United States, along with Vatican help, because the Vatican had to be there to do the money laundering, and the question becomes, where did they do it? Well, they started in Burma, and that was a cash cow. And they funded all of their covert activities, the strength, all these wars that they had to fight against communism. And the money was coming in, hand over fist. Just millions of dollars by the hour. And they had to figure out a way to fund these groups, and they can't go through Congress, could they? So they used, banks like the Vatican Bank that have no oversight. And they money launder it. It goes into the Vatican and comes out very clean. And they use it right to fund all their wars. Now, the Vatican, of course, didn't employ their army of priests i.e. the Jesuit order, to actually do all the dirty work, although you can bet that they were there to oversee a lot of this stuff and infiltrate a lot of these organizations all around the world. But they use, of course, the United States and other countries to do their dirty work. And that's where CIA or OSS Chief William Donovan, they used to call him Wild Bill William Donovan, got together and formed, the OSS was the precursor to the CIA. But that's where this whole idea started. Now, the idea started in Burma, and I'm just going to give you an overview, and it's very complicated how they do this. So this chapter really details how the Vatican and the Jesuits use our CIA and our assets to fund the drug war and to fund drugs, to bring drugs to our country, to other countries of the world, drug the people, get the money, and then basically fund all these covert activities. And they're doing the same thing today. Burma, let me just say this, dried up. There was, problems in Burma due to the climate. So they had to leave, and that's why we're in Afghanistan. So the whole thing is now shifted to Afghanistan today, and that's the reason we're still there. And isn't it amazing, if you really do your research, you'll find that many of our troops are there guarding these poppy fields and not really engaged in anything else. So, how are the inner workings of this? How does it really operate? Because, when you make a statement like I just made, you gotta start thinking, well, how can they actually do this? So I ran across this book called The Operation Paper, the United States and Drugs in Thailand and Burma. And it traces this from World War II to today on how they do this. And the reason that it's also interesting is that if you follow politics, in the last month or so, Trump and the administration made a huge splash all over the country regarding how they're going to spend all this money to stop the opioid crisis in America. People are dying left and right. The only problem with that is it's a bit hypocritical because we're the ones that actually bring the drugs. Our government, along with their covert people, actually bring the drugs with the help of the mob, the Vatican, and the cartels, and they all take a cut to the people. So they create the problem, then they create a paper-thin solution, and life goes on. And the other thing you have to remember is that the war on drugs has been going on since I can remember I was a kid. Every president and, they have a policy, we have a war on drugs. But the war on drugs never works. Drug trafficking always gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and they keep making more and more money. So let's look a little bit at Operation Paper. I had no idea what Operation Paper really was, or is, and this chapter 3 in this book called The American War Machine describes how they really how they work, how the Vatican and Jesuits employ our military. We always said on this show that we are the military arm of the Illuminati, Vatican, Jesuit New World Order, which is in full gear right now, folks. We're on the precipice of what could be a major conflict. I hope that they just decide to delay it at least till baseball season's over. I really don't want this season interrupted, do you? I usually say once baseball season starts, then we're free and clear, because there's a lot of money involved in baseball, but I don't know anymore if that will hold true. And if you look at the history of war, they love to go to war in the spring, nice weather, nice and cool. They don't get their tanks all muddied down in the mud and the snow. But this kind of war, I don't think they're going to even use, I think it's going to be very quick. And I think now we have 7 ships now headed for the, near Syria to bomb the hell out of them, along with many, many other assets that we have been building up. And Russia and China have been doing the same thing. So the winds of war are blowing. Let's see what happens. Okay, chapter 3 from this book, The American War Machine, describes America's Operation Paper. It was a November 1950 program to arm and supply the remnant troops of General Lee Mi in Burma. Operation Paper itself was relatively short-lived, but it had long-term consequences that have not been adequately discussed and are going on still to today. The first is that the CIA was launched into a 50-year history of indirectly facilitating and directly facilitating and overseeing forces engaged in vastly expanding the production of opiates. So here we are helping the opiate problem, helping create this problem. And now we hear the President of the United States say, we're going to stop opioids in America. And that just happened this last month because of this epidemic. Well, why did the epidemic start? Because we brought it over here. And this is the history of this international drug trafficking that stretches almost continuously from Thailand and Burma through Laos in the 70s and then to present-day Afghanistan. You always wonder where they get all this money to fund these crazy wars and buy all this crazy military that is under the table. You see, we've just also got a military budget of $712 billion approved by Congress and Trump. And I always say the reason is we got to put up at least a pretty good fight when we hear from our leaders that America is no longer prepared at this particular time to protect our citizens from a war on two fronts, which has always been the goal of our military. So don't feel too safe in America, folks. Now, we're talking about this movement from Burma, Laos, Thailand, and Laos in the 70s to present-day Afghanistan. Now, the second thing we want to talk about is that the resulting drug proceeds help supplement the CIA's efforts to develop its own Asian proxy armies, like we've talked about. Initially defensive, but increasingly offensive. You see, this led in 1959 to the initiation of armed conflict in previously neutral and Buddhist nation of Laos, an unwinnable hot war that soon spread to, guess where? Well, we lost over 60,000 men in Vietnam and countless injured. Now, the decision to launch Operation Paper, this was made by a small cabal outside the Office of Policy Coordination, notably people like Desmond Fitzgerald, Richard Stilwell, in conjunction with OSS Chief William Donovan. And you're never going to hear people like Pope Pius XII and other Vatican and Jesuit insiders, because they're always behind the scenes. Now, they favored a rollback of communism over the official State Department's policy of containment. So I always wondered why we had this push against communism, how we ended up in Vietnam. This book by Dale Scott sees the expanding offensive efforts in Southeast Asia, switching from Lee Mi's forces to the CIA's Thai proxy army, Peru, P-A-R-U, as a watershed in the conversion of America's post-war defense establishment, which was concerned above all with preserving the status quo in Western Europe, into today's offensive American war machine, with action centered on Southeast and Central Asia. The writing of American War Machine has given me me a clearer picture of America's overall responsibilities for the huge increases in global drug trafficking since World War II. This is exemplified by the more than doubling of the Afghan opium drug production since the U.S. invaded that country in 2001. So did you hear that? So we go to war in Iraq. Supposedly they had weapons of mass destruction, which they never had, 9/11, etc., as the pretext. We get into Afghanistan, and guess what? The drug trafficking has doubled. What do you think their reason for going there was? But the U.S. responsibility for the president-dominant role of Afghanistan in the global heroin traffic has merely replicated what had happened earlier in Burma. You know, that great plan that Pope Pius XII and William Donovan and others in the OSS had. Thailand and Laos between the 40s and the 70s. These countries also became factors in the international drug traffic as a result of CIA assistance. So, what is this hypocrisy going on in this country? Why can't you get this on the mainstream news? Because they are controlled by the Vatican-led New World Order. Now, the French, in the case of Laos, were there to what would otherwise have been only local drug traffickers. Okay? So we help push, the French help push drugs, not only to there, but to our people and to all over the world to actually fund these covert wars. So now, guess who's backing Trump's move into Syria? Of course, France and England. And they're going to go down the tubes just like America. What do you think that the Pope and the Vatican and the Jesuits have created this migration that's destroying Europe, destroying Western civilization? Now, it's not too much to conclude that for such large reasons of policy, U.S. authorities actually suborned at times an increase of illicit heroin traffic. An understanding of this phenomenon must inform future scholarly work on drug trafficking in Asia. Sure, it'll never change. If opium could be useful in achieving victory, the pattern was clear. We would use opium. Of course they would. Now, what about Thailand and drugs? Let's go back a bit. A personal, we got to look at this closely. Let's go back to the 50s. Come on, people. It's not that far back. Americans are like, oh, you go back to 2001, and that's like, oh, hey, that doesn't matter anymore. It's too far behind us. Let's move forward. Well, let's go back to November 1950 when President Truman, faced with large numbers of Chinese communist troops pouring into Korea, approved an operation codenamed Operation Paper to prepare the KMT forces in Burma for a countervailing invasion. It is clear also that these troops, the so-called 93rd Division under KMT General Lee Mi, were already involved in drug trafficking. It is clear, finally, that, as we will see, Truman belatedly approved a supply operation to drug traffickers that had already been in existence for some time. The purpose we're talking about here is to explore this process that led up to Truman's validation of a program to use drug proxies in Burma. It will be an exercise that it requires looking deeply into history, which many people don't do, and if you're not going to get this in the history books, by the way, raising questions that the records presently available cannot definitely answer. Of course, they're written by the Jesuits. Some of the most relevant records, chiefly those of the Office of Policy and Coordination, OPC, that initiated Operation Paper, are mysteriously still closed to the public view. Others, such as those of the World Commerce Corporation, or the Willis Bird import-export firm in Bangkok, would probably tell us little, even if we had them. And some of the most important events, such as the path of which the Thailand opium monopoly, opium soon reached the streets of Boston, were probably never documented at all. This is a major look at post-war history of China as well, Southeast Asia, and the global drug traffic, with needed U.S. support. Above all, in the form of aircraft and arms, Lee Mi's irregulars were soon marketing, in the words of their U.S. overseer Richard Stilwell, chief of OPC Far East, almost a third of the world's opium supply. Where was the money going? Much of it right through the Vatican Bank and other banks they set up that don't have oversight. And you're not going to hear Congress ever talk. Now, Burton Hirsch about this, right? Burton Hirsch, who transmits Stilwell's comments, adds his own remark that Lee Mi's troops, quote, developed over time into an important commercial asset for the CIA. Based on what is currently known, the relationship differently, Lee Mi's drug trafficking troops continue to be of major importance to the CIA, but as self-supporting, off-the-books allies in the struggle to secure Southeast Asia's against communist advances, not as a source of income. Sure, for the CIA. Wow. This is good because we're looking at the overview. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Hi, Greg Anthony here from the Investigative Journal, and I've never steered you wrong before when it comes to talking about the truth regarding your political and social worlds you live in. And I don't plan on steering you wrong today when I say get involved in the hemp revolution, hemp for health and wealth. I know of some of the best hemp oils on the market. If you haven't tried them, you have to. And pay attention, they're lab tested. So contact me, Greg Anthony, at gregbeacon@gmail.com. That's Greg Beacon, G-R-E-G, like boy, E-A-C-O-N.com. And I'll hook you up with some of the best hemp products on the market. And if you want to become a sales associate and make some money selling hemp to your friends and family, do that. Contact Greg Anthony at the Investigative Journal, Greg Beacon at gmail.com, Greg Beacon at gmail.com.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the Supreme Jesuit Command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This ain't happening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour. We're talking about how the United States government, as well as the Vatican, Jesuit order, are involved in drug trafficking worldwide. Let's do a quick overview. Then I want to play a good presentation on the Vatican, Mafia, and money laundering, because I said a long time ago there's substantial proof to show that the Vatican Bank for years and years has been used as a top money laundering bank since there's no oversight. And I know that from court documents done in a case called Alprin v. Vatican Bank, when an attorney try to get to the bottom of what goes on at the Vatican Bank, and it's impossible. Next to impossible, I should say. But this overview, we're going back in the 50s, after World War II, the chances seem greater than ever before for a more peaceful, orderly, legal, and open world. Even the world's two great superpowers, the U.S. and Soviet Union, had agreed on rules and procedures for mediating their serious differences. That seems to have gone to hell in a handbasket today when you're looking at what's going on in Syria, right? So the whole thing has been a long staged process, and this is a very technical area, so I don't want to go into it all, because from the very beginning of the post-war era, Washington looked for proxies of its own to combat the threat it perceived of world revolution. Some of these proxies are now virtually forgotten, such as the Ukrainian guerrillas, originally organized by Hitler's SS, who fought an OPC-backed losing battle against Russia into the 50s. Some, like the Mafias in Italy, soon outgrew their U.S. support to become de facto regional players in their own right. And it goes on and on and on. Did you know that one of America's early proxy armies, the remnants of the nationalist Chinese KMT forces in Burma and later Thailand, would continue to receive U.S. support into the 60s? Like the Mafias in Europe and the Yakuza in Japan, these drug proxies had the advantage for secrecy of being off-the-books assets, largely self-supporting through their drug dealing and firmly anti-communist. The OPC and CIA's initial support for this program, by re-establishing a major drug traffic of Southeast Asia, helped institutionalize what became a CIA's habit of turning to drug-supported off-the-books assets for fighting wars wherever they appeared to be a threat to America, access to oil or other resources in Indochina from the 50s to the 70s, in Afghanistan, in Central America in the 80s, in Colombia in the 90s, and again in Afghanistan in 2001. Let's continue this another day, but I did want to get to this presentation, and it's really good, regarding the Vatican and money laundering and the Mafia and much, much more. And I thought you'd really like this because aside from being run by the Mafia and the Masons and murdering Catholic popes and being involved in controlling these together the Vatican and Jesuits with these organizations, while puppeting their worship to Catholics to control them politically, the Vatican is also, and still is, waging secret war against the financial systems of the West, especially and including America, pilfering their banking systems and laundering embezzlement and drug money they obtain through the Mafia, which works for them, in its Vatican Bank, which is a Nazi money laundering operation, not a bank. The Vatican is a full-fledged criminal organization with accountability to no one, not even the Catholics they deceive and murder. Let's look at the Vatican, Mafia, and money laundering.
Didn't die of natural causes, but may have been the victim of a murder perpetrated by the Vatican itself. But could the Vatican really be involved in something as nefarious as murder? We're learning murder may just be the tip of the iceberg.
We've been looking into the death of Pope John Paul I. Do you believe that anyone would have wanted the Pope dead? Perhaps the motivation would be that John Paul I wanted to reform the Vatican Bank, change the way things are done, and fire some people. So there may have been animosity between Marcinkus, who was head of the Vatican Bank, and the Pope.
Paul Marcinkus was a rough-and-tumble American archbishop who was in charge of the Vatican Bank. The Vatican Bank was never meant to turn a profit. Any surplus was supposed to be used for religion or charity. But Marcinkus had some suspicious associations. For one, he was a known member of the Freemasons. And second, he's thought to have ties to the Mafia. And yes, I just said Vatican, Freemasons, and Mafia in one sentence. And yes, I just said Vatican, Freemasons, and Mafia in one sentence.
Yeah, we're looking at the New World Order. In the mid-1800s, let's look what happened there. If you trace up Masonry through all its orders, till you come to the grand tip-top head of the Mason world, you will discover that the dread individual and chief of the Society of Jesus are one and the same person. As early as the mid-1800s, American historian and biographer James Parton had uncovered the fact. What did he uncover? That the Masons and the Jesuits were secretly connected at the top of their organizations through the Vatican. But in the mid-1800s, the third element of Vatican power, the Italian Mafia, was just beginning its ascent to political control. Let's look at Sicily. I have visited Sicily.
Beauty and brutality have lived side by side for thousands of years. It was here in a world of shadows, secrets, and myth that the Mafia was born.
The Mafia has no goal other than to enrich itself and to get power.
The mafioso is a crude, violent person.
Through terror and murder, a small minority held Sicily in its grip. Eventually, their influence reached all the way to the highest levels of Italian government and beyond.
We're talking about global organized crime.
After shaping each other for more than a century, Sicily and the Mafia had become almost inseparable. Even before there was a Mafia, Sicily was no stranger to brutal subjugation. Strategically set in the middle of the Mediterranean, the island was a crossroads for invading armies. The Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, and the Spaniards all forced their will on the Sicilians.
Sicily was conquered over and over again throughout its history by various people. This meant that frequently they were governed by distant rulers who cared very little about the lives of local people.
In reaction to these occupations, the Sicilian people developed a fierce distrust of authority. Differences were settled without involving the courts or the police. Blood and honor meant everything. In the absence of any legitimate government, the influence of these new local bosses filled the vacuum.
They were the ones who enforced the laws, who helped enforce contracts. If you bought a horse then, you brought in a mafioso to help check the teeth, to check the animal and make sure that he was a good animal. They'd help certify the transactions.
The capo mafioso, the head of each mafia family, was called a man of respect or a man of honor.
Everything happened in the economy, in society, in culture, even in religion. Even in religion. Even in religion. Even in religion was controlled by this man of honor.
For example, the individual who impregnates your daughter, the mafioso, in fact, can insist that this individual marry the young lady, and his decisions aren't appealable. When he says that the marriage must take place, there will either be a marriage or there'll be a funeral.
During the early 1900s, a capo named Don Vito Cascioferro epitomized the status these so-called men of honor had attained. Don Vito got rich from cattle rustling and collecting protection money. Most farmers and businessmen readily paid Don Vito out of respect for his authority and fear of retaliation. Such fear was warranted. Those who refused payment faced a death sentence to be carried out by an assassin armed with the Mafia's weapon of choice, the shotgun. No one, not even victims or their relatives, dared report what they saw. To squeal meant certain death. As a result, the Mafia could carry out its criminal activities with the silent complicity of the Sicilian people. There was no shortage of peasant boys who longed to become men of honor. So capos were able to extend their power by expanding their mob families.
I did want to mention one thing. I just wanted to give you a little overview of the Mafia in Italy. Now, I lived there for 7 years, understood a little bit about the Vatican involvement in that original story they mentioned earlier in this presentation regarding Paul Marcinkus and the Vatican bank scandal. And I learned firsthand how the Vatican and the Mafia work hand in hand. And that takes me to an interview I did with Tony Gambino, the godson of the late head of the Gambino crime family. And he said the same exact thing. The Vatican profits more, probably, than the mafia bosses. He said the Vatican and the governments make more than the mafia bosses. They all work together. So that's why I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of the way that the mafia worked in Sicily. And I found it interesting. When I was there, I met a guy in the town I lived in. I didn't know that he was the right-hand man of the head of the Camorra, which was the Naples Mafia. And he lived in the town, said he was a land investor. Young guy, drove a Maserati all the time. And when I learned he was a top guy in the Camorra is when I saw himself splashed all over the front page of a newspaper when he was killed. Back to the Vatican, Mafia, and money laundering.
Young men who exhibited a knack for violence were handpicked and given assignments. Murder was typically their final test, a prerequisite to becoming a full-fledged member of the Mafia. Each recruit was initiated in a secret ceremony steeped in Catholic symbolism. The ritual consisted of an oath of silence known as omerta, sealed with blood pricked from the initiate's finger, then smeared onto the image of a saint.
And they burn a saint card in their hands, and they say, I will burn like this if I betray the organization.
This dedication to secrecy, coupled with the threat of violence, allowed the Sicilian underworld to tighten its grip on the island's economy. Even though members of the Mafia were just a small fraction of the population, they managed to control most business transactions, shaking down farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers. The poverty and terror this created forced many Sicilians to abandon their homeland.
In the first decades of the 20th century, 1 million people left Sicily. This was the best of Sicily. To emigrate meant, we tried, we were defeated, let's try to build a better future somewhere else.
Many Sicilians fled to America looking for...
And I must say that 1 million Sicilians fled to America. They fled Italy to escape life under the Vatican's Mafia.
a better life. But the traditions of the Mafia made the journey right along with them.
Codes of omerta, codes of rispetto, those codes and that culture was brought with Sicilian immigrants to the United States.
By the early 1900s, much of Sicily had come under the Mafia's control. Bosses like Don Vito Cascioferro were raking in enormous sums of money through protection rackets. Police, judges, and politicians were their pawns. There appeared to be no limit to the Mafia's strength. Until 1922, when Benito Mussolini came to power in Rome. His vendetta against the Sicilian underworld would nearly destroy it. But an accident of history would see the Mafia emerge from World War II more entrenched and more violent than ever. The Allies invaded Sicily in 1943. They released hundreds of mobsters from jail, mistaking them for political prisoners.
The Allied military commanders did not understand the concept of Mafia. So all of a sudden, they were appointing mafiosi, particularly capo mafiosi, as mayors, as heads of the various forms of government.
Among these was Don Carlo Vizzini, one of the most powerful and respected mafia bosses in Sicily. The United States Army appointed him mayor. After the war, Don Carlo was approached by one of Italy's leading political parties, the Christian Democrats.
The Christian Democratic Party makes a political deal with Don Carlo, and Don Carlo makes a public announcement that he, in fact, is in favor of the Christian Democratic Party, and the result of that is that other capo mafiosi also make that pledge.
It was the beginning of a long and close relationship between the Christian Democrats and the Mafia.
Quindi io ti do il voto, tu mi fai il favore.
If I give you a vote, you give me a favor. This is the fundamental way that it operates. Cosa Nostra does not have its own ideology per se. Agreements can be made without problems.
Non lo fa senza problemi.
This new arrangement was mutually beneficial. The Christian Democrats were able to dominate other political parties vying for power, and Don Kahlo was able to line his pockets with government money.
One piece of news that I have found not very commonly known is that in 1972, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus made the Diocese of Venice sell their bank. And as you know, the Archbishop of Venice at the time was John Paul I.
Before John Paul I became Pope, he was in charge of the Venice Bank. Marcinkus forced the sale of the Venice Bank without consulting the Pope-to-be, turning a charitable organization into a for-profit business. That's not just a hostile takeover, that's original gangster.
In October 1957, scores of mafiosi converged on the Grand Hotel de Palm in Palermo for a summit that lasted 4 days. It was during these discussions that the Sicilian Mafia decided to form a commission to govern their affairs. They called it the Cupola. The Cupola would settle disputes, make policy, and divvy up territory. In the early 1960s, the Sicilian Mafia moved into a lucrative new racket, international drug trafficking. Mob bosses oversaw a vast heroin network, processing raw morphine base from opium poppies harvested in Iran and Afghanistan, then smuggling it across Turkey.
The Sicilians would then bring that morphine base to Sicily, where in hidden labs it would be refined and shipped to trusted people in the United States.
The profits that came pouring in were enough to satisfy everyone. With the blessing of the American mob, some Sicilian gangsters moved their operations to the U.S., using pizza parlors as fronts for heroin trafficking.
The Americans wanted the Sicilians to take over the heroin business for them because they were getting too much heat in the United States for it, and so the Sicilians were then used as a partner with the American Mafia in what was a very lucrative and dangerous business.
Heroin trafficking had become a multi-billion-dollar business for Sicilian mob families, and it was only going to get bigger.
All of them started to be heavily involved into heroin trafficking. They got to the peak of their power when they supplied 85% of the New York market.
Politicians, judges, and police who crossed the Corleonese often became their next targets.
In Palermo, they killed in 5 years all authorities of the city. They killed the mayor, they killed the governor, they killed the head of opposition, they killed the chief prosecutor twice, 2 of them. They killed the head of the Carabinieri. They killed simply everybody who was starting to challenge their authority.
The Corleone Capo was now in command of the Sicilian Mafia's vast criminal empire, a network of terror and extortion that controlled nearly every aspect of political and economic life on the island. The mob's notorious grip on the upper ranks of Italian politics remained powerful.
The Pope was upset that Marcinkus sold his bank when the purpose of the bank in Venice was to help, shall we say, underprivileged people, and all of a sudden it's going to be completely run over by the Vatican Bank. And Marcinkus had made some ill-advised transactions.
Money laundering.
I don't know that. He mentions that the Vatican Bank purchased a series of properties that went bust. Not to be naive, there have been accusations of laundering by the Vatican Bank up until very recently, in fact.
We now know that John Paul I had seen corruption in the Vatican Bank firsthand. So is it possible that the Pope's plan to clean up the streets and go after crooked bankers motivated Vatican assassins to end the papacy of John Paul I almost before it began? You can't write this stuff. Well, okay, you can, but we all know the scariest story of all is the true one. Pope John Paul I took the papacy in 1978 and basically said he was going to get tough on crime. He was found dead in his bed 33 days into his reign. Some believe that his intention was to publicly out Freemasons working within the Vatican hierarchy and take down crooked bankers who were believed to be connected to the Mafia. And maybe not so surprisingly, little was done to investigate his death.
At the time, the Vatican Bank was a sort of offshore bank based in Vatican. So you get a bank account and you can transfer money wherever you want without being known. So your identity remains secret. So it's ideal for money laundering. The Vatican Bank is obviously a bank, so its purpose is that of making profits. And Roberto Calvi helped the Vatican Bank at doing so.
Who exactly was Robert Calvi?
He was a very successful banker, an extremely successful banker. He came up as an ordinary man, but he rapidly ascended to the top of the management of this bank, and he got the nickname God's Banker.
Roberto Calvi was known as God's Banker because of his close association with the Vatican. Calvi had tremendous influence and power within the financial world, but it appears that from his high position in the Vatican, Marcinkus, the guy who changed the Vatican Bank from a for-charity into a for-profit bank, could make Calvi do whatever he wanted.
A man is found hanging from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge in London. It looked pretty gruesome. His suit pockets are stuffed with bricks and cash.
He knew a hell of a lot and had some very embarrassing secrets.
Head of Italy's largest private bank. $1 billion in bad debts. Connected to the Mafia, the Freemasons, and the heart of the Catholic Church.
All of those groups may have had an interest in his elimination.
Bizarre suicide? Or a ritualistic murder?
Well, if he hadn't walked on that scaffolding, it means somebody must have put him there.
This is the body of God's banker. At 7:30 a.m., June 18th, 1982, his body was found swinging from Blackfriars Bridge. The cause of death, asphyxiation by hanging.
The police must have arrived within 5 minutes. All they done is literally brought the boat in. One policeman held the body while the other one sort of cut the rope and dropped him into the boat. It was only like 3 days later that it came out, it was Roberto Calvi.
Roberto Calvi was the man people called God's banker. Now technically, he was more like the Pope's banker, but that doesn't sound quite as impressive. Anyway, he earned his rather grand title by becoming head of Italy's largest private bank, and more importantly, getting mixed up in the Vatican's complicated finances.
I've been tipped off that there's one man who may be able to give me some answers. Archbishop Marcinkus, the right-hand man to Pope John Paul II.
Harley Davidson, so American.
Okay, I got to cut it off there, and that brings back great memories. I'll get to this part of Marcinkus' story tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.